Marvel Rivals has been nothing short of a cultural phenomenon, at least within the hero shooter genre, and something that we haven't really seen since 2020 with the release of Valorant. But despite that, I am planning on moving on for the most part for now, and while this is mostly a personal decision, not a recommendation, I do think it's important for me to clarify why. Not just for some hopefully constructive criticism of the game, but also to hopefully help explain some of the reasons why people within my gaming demographic just haven't really stuck with it. First off, I think it's important to clarify who I am. My name is Spilo. I am a professional Overwatch coach. I've been coaching Overwatch League all the way down to bronze players for 7 years, and Marvel Rivals was really the first Overwatch competitor that I actually really enjoyed. It's an actual hero shooter compared to Valorant and Apex that just feel like shooters with a couple of extra abilities. It feels like there's a team emphasis on this game, and I've spent over 200 plus hours playing, coaching, and analyzing the game from alpha, beta, and invitational closed beta, and live, climbing to Grandmaster myself with a positive win rate on a couple of different characters. I say all this knowing that obviously I haven't really scratched the surface of what this game can really provide at the highest level, so this is going to be a criticism not from a casual perspective, but from a semi-interested, semi-competitive player, and somebody that is just invested in the competitive side of really any game that I've ever touched. Before I get a little bit too detailed here, I am going to tell one little anecdote here. There's a message within my Discord that I want to read, and it really clarifies, I think, some of the history surrounding the heroes genre competitive side of things, and maybe just the political headspace of gaming as a whole. The Marvel Rival versus Overwatch stuff is giving me a lot of deja vu of the old TF2 versus Overwatch discussions back in 2016. Back then, I stuck with TF2 because I found myself having more fun in that game as opposed to Overwatch. But back then, a lot of TF2 content creators and players who were burned out on the game were quite happy to jump ship to Overwatch. This caused a great deal of animosity between the two game communities, where people who played Overwatch said that TF2 was an old relic that people needed to move on from, and people who still play TF2 said that Overwatch just doesn't have that special something that makes TF2 so great. As someone who was very deeply invested in TF2 during this time, a lot of that animosity was built on fear that TF2 is becoming less relevant, and that people didn't see or appreciate how amazing this game is, especially for new players who were gravitating towards Overwatch over TF2. Many criticisms of Overwatch at that time was that it dumbed down the more accessible game, which is the same thing happening today. People who stuck with TF2 would point to the game's more complex movement text like rocket jumping and contrast that to heroes like Pharah, who just press one button to do a more limited and what felt like to many TF2 players at the time a less nuanced version of the same mechanic. Can you think of any similar arguments made towards Marvel Rivals? And I think this one was just such an interesting and insightful post. Unfortunately, I wasn't really a TF2 fan and was not really invested in the hero shooter genre at the time, so I'm gonna have to take this chatter's word at face value here, but I'm sure many people would back that experience up, and it lines up with my experience with Overwatch. Even though we still have some of those old Overwatch 1 relic characters like Mercy, characters like Junkrat, Bastion, and so on, without exception, all of those characters have actually been increased in terms of the skill expression they can provide, both the skill floor and the skill ceiling of what you can actually do with the characters. And honestly, while Overwatch Classic was a fun little side quest for me for a couple of hours, I really got bored because of how little skill expression and how few interesting things you could do with the old game. While there was a lot of flash and explosive things to do, ultimately the depth of the game just meant that it wasn't something that I wanted to go back and play again. So ironically, while it was a game that I initially fell in love with, it was not a game that I would have grown up with if it had not matured along with a community that played it. And this is ultimately where I find myself in some similarities to Marvel Rivals. Comparing Overwatch Classic to Marvel Rivals is definitely not a one-to-one analogy. Marvel Rivals has significantly more complicated individual hero kits, there's a lot more buttons to push and a lot more nuance, but ultimately I find many of my complaints about the gameplay loop and the game design to be a lot of the same. Big, explosive, flashy moments, but without the same depth that Overwatch 2 currently has. So it gives me some level of comfort here, not just because we've been here before, but also for many of my gripes, spoiler alert, with Marvel Rivals, there's going to be a lot of hope that this game can actually evolve in the same way that Overwatch did, and hopefully without a lot of the drama. Ultimately, while Overwatch has stumbled over its own corporate feet more than once, it has, at the point now, developed a pretty interesting, nuanced, and fun game, at least for me. There's a lot of depth, there's a lot more nuance, objectively, in terms of how characters and the macro of the game is able to express itself. And ultimately, for my demographic of what I'm interested in, that is what keeps me playing. And I do believe that Rivals has that same ceiling, especially when you're considering the passionate developers that Rivals have. So while I don't know if Rivals is going to evolve in the way that I want it to, I do have hope that they can shape the game and learn as things go on. And even if they don't go in the direction that I personally want them to go, it will still not only be a fun experience, but a game of choice for a lot of people. So let's start the video of the rise and fall of Marvel Rivals at least for me. First off, we'll start off with some of the good things, and there's a lot of good things that Rivals did well, and I'm going to start with no particular order here. First off, the DPS hero variety. This game has so many different DPS characters that do so many different things. Melee characters, combo characters, unique fun designs, poke, hybrid mobility, Mr. Fantastic, Winter Soldier, Spider-Man, Magic, and Black Panther. These are characters that are not only good in their own right, but in contrast to many of the Overwatch characters, they can actually compete, if not supersede, the ability to just express skill in so many different directions. I find myself impressed at the amount of DPS characters that really stuck with me, considering that I was more of a tank and support player in Overwatch. Hero bans are phenomenal and really put emphasis on the ability of allowing players to control their own lobbies. Public replays and spectating a top 500 is an amazing, cool thing that I never even thought of, and Overwatch absolutely needs to implement this. In-game tournaments, public win rate and pick rate stats, which Overwatch absolutely needs to do. Hero progression, ranked rewards, such as getting different skins, depending on what rank you finished with the previous season. Team-ups encouraging team play. Some criticisms of that, more on that later. Third-person POV for a different perspective, showing off the skin. The IP is very strong. There's very fast matchmaking. There's more expansive hero kits, something that I hope will continue to influence Overwatch moving forward. The perma battle pass, the soundtrack is actually pretty sick as well. And then something that is definitely partly a criticism for me, but is definitely has an upside too, which is the maximum dopamine and uptime of a lot of team fights. Compared to Overwatch, where there's a little bit more of downtime, there's just a lot more going on for a lot longer in Marvel Rivals, and that definitely has its upsides. And so while this video is going to be more on the criticism side of things about what's not keeping me invested in Rivals, I do think that those things are at least worth mentioning to highlight the things that not only that Rivals did well, but that Rivals did uniquely well and better than other games. Not everything has to be a comparison, but ultimately when we judge something, we often judge it off of a standard. That standard may be CS, Overwatch, League of Legends, or anything else, depending on what genre we're comparing it to, and Rivals just did it really well. And not only were those things good in the Rivals side of things, but they made me think more about like, oh, all the other games that I play, what if they implemented those things too? Ultimately, without Rivals really breaking the ground in so many different aspects, there would be a missed opportunity for evolution for some of the other games that we love. Now, all that being said, we really do have to kind of crunch down here about why Rivals hasn't really stuck with me as time has gone on. And those two things are mostly game design and competitive integrity. And the game design one especially is going to take a little while to get through, and we're going to break it down to a couple of categories. The first off, we'll just give an overview of what I mean by game design. And what I mean by that is like, what is the way that the game is being played? If I try to explain a game like Overwatch, a lot of it is about resource trades from different positions and from different angles that lead to advantages that lead to one team fights. Obviously, that expression comes through cooldown management, ultimate management, and mechanics, but there's a lot of positioning nuance in the game because of the amount of mobility, space, angles, flanks, and even little things like passive heal that allow for a lot more creativity in how you can position yourself, especially in comparison to Overwatch 1. For me, Rivals just felt a lot more focused on the raw damage and the raw sustain and the cooldown trades, the layering, so to speak, and there was less emphasis on the angles and space. Space is always important for any first-person shooter, anything, honestly, even just competitive games as a whole. Space is a very important concept. However, due to the fact of just how important raw damage and raw healing was and how punishing it can be to take different creative angles, ultimately that nuance that Overwatch evolved into over the years just fell off for me with Rivals. The raw amount of healing that you could do, the raw amount of damage that you could do, even flankers on poor supports, felt like it was designed to create a massive uptime, a lot of dopamine, a lot of engagement, but potentially at the expense of competitive integrity and creative expression. You can even look at the example of characters like Jeff, whose primary fire healing is honestly ultimate level when compared to anything that what Overwatch can do, almost 2 times the amount of Mercy's healing beam. And when I was confronted with this, I honestly couldn't believe it. You marry that with characters like Moon Knight that could just vomit out damage with almost no risk whatsoever, and ultimately that's kind of how a lot of the DPS and healer design in Marvel Rivals feels. I think my concern with this was that could we not just nerf this? Could we not just nerf healing, nerf damage? But then I came across a problem here that if we nerfed healing too much, then we wonder if tanks would be able to keep themselves alive at any point in time. You see, a lot of the tank designs are, big hulking masses of flesh, even when they're dive tanks. And I wonder that if there's even an option to nerf sustain, if they did that, would DPS characters not just completely run over everything on the cast? And this brings me to my problem here, is I feel that this is by design. I don't necessarily think this is a balance problem. This seems exactly how the game was designed. And so to change this, there'd have to be a monumental rework of how the characters and how the game functions as a whole. And I just don't think that that's likely to happen. And to piggyback off of that, I think that the ease and the accessibility of many of the DPS and support roles really confirms this for me. If you look at the ult design in Marvel Rivals, a lot of it is just glut of healing, glut of sustain, glut of damage in an AoE area, and that's basically it. There are very few utility individual ultimates that can provide different things. It's mostly just a lot of damage that, if not responded to with the support ult, is going to result in a lot of kills. And while that's very satisfying for big casual team wipes, 4Ks, 5Ks, and so on, and then obviously for support, it's just really important that you keep your team alive, so you need a lot of sustain. Again, the gameplay loop, the nuance, the complexity just isn't there for me. I'm not saying that necessarily the DPS heroes are easy to play or support heroes are easy to play. They all have their skill expressions, they all have their ceilings. A lot of the skill expression is hitting those timing windows perfectly, and I think that's cool. But ultimately, from a gameplay loop on the neutral, outside of the ultimates, I just don't find the same level of creativity that really sticks with me with Overwatch. This is layered with a couple of other minor complaints. There's still no passive heal in this game. When you're out of combat, you're completely reliant off of health packs and healers. There's a lot of inconsistency on available flank routes because of the map design. There's an inconsistency on support mobility, with the exception of Jeff, I suppose. So you are unable to take a lot of space as a support. Heck, they even nerfed Mantis mobility of all the things to nerf, so that there aren't a lot of supports that can help you take space, and the support's ability to take space themselves is also limited. And so it leads me to a lot of layering, more passive angles, and more frontline trades, which is to me the least interesting expression of skill within this game. Now, it brought me to an interesting analogy, something that I've talked about before, which is, can there be a lot of skill expression? Can there be a lot of interest in a very high damage, high sustain kind of setup? And I actually think that there is. Let me tell you a little story here. I used to play a lot of Lord of the Rings online, unorganized 6v6. So they're unofficial 6v6 tournaments. We would do bad guys versus good guys. I'm not going to get so much into how PvP worked, but ultimately that game was pretty imbalanced from a healing and raw damage standpoint. There was a lot of easy damage available and a lot of easy healing available, but what ended up happening from the macro of the high level play was the timing of debuffs and buffs. Basically, you had the opportunity to synchronize pressure on debuffs like a Warg puddle or a incoming heal debuff or a stun inside of a puddle, and then the defenders would have to utilize a defensive bubble or a defensive cooldown in preparation for it. And if you could scout that the setup was happening, because it took about 10 seconds to get the debuff timing. So there's a lot of skill in actually setting up for those one-shot plays to deny the enemy healing and or being aware of those things. And so for me, while it wasn't necessarily the most fun thing of all time, it was still more fun and from a macro perspective than what Rivals had, because a lot of the kill potential came from debuffs and buffs that weren't just ultimates. So in other words, there was a cycle of pressure that wasn't waiting for an ultimate to happen. There were still windows on 20, 30-second timers, and that made that game, even though the 6v6 wasn't as good as Overwatch, it still felt like there were windows of vulnerability that if you were skillful enough, you could either deny or enable, depending on which side that you're on. Ultimately, with Rivals, I don't see that's the case as much. We do have abilities like Cloak's frontline window here. I can't even remember what it's called, but it's the debuff on frontline. There's certain even crowd control like Winter Soldier's Hook or Hulk's Stun, but ultimately the difficulty and the consistency with which you're able to synchronize and utilize these abilities, it doesn't feel like that's an inherent part of the game design. Ultimately, it really just comes down to farming an ult and denying an ultimate. And this is confirmed further by the fact that, well, we've had many patches since this has been a problem in the game design and nothing's happened. There's really not been any serious attempt to nerf support ults, certainly not support ult duration. See, the main problem with support ults is not that they have a lot of healing, because that's probably necessary to deny the amount of damage, but the fact that they not only deny the damage, but then continue to deny damage for many seconds afterwards. Luna Snow is the obvious example here, but this really applies to basically every support ult that applies healing. It's just a confirmation of game design, and it leads me to be suspicious that this is done specifically to draw out team fights, so there's more engagement, more uptime, and yes, more dopamine, more shooty, so to speak. There's also not been as much love or assessment of how higher skill characters, especially mobile characters, in terms of their execution. It does feel very easy to one-shot bad supports with a lot of these mobile characters, but the ceiling of what they can do in higher ranks feels like a skill check of the supports themselves, and again, there's been really no changes to help fix that problem. It's the same problem as old school Overwatch back in 2017, where Genjis and Tracers all of a sudden were denied by characters like Mercy, Brigitte, and Moira. Finally, on the design front, there is a little bit of a subjective discussion about the DPS versus tank and support design. Got a lot of criticism for early on in Rivals' careers saying that I wasn't a big fan of their tank and support design, but honestly, I'm going to stand by that one moving forward. I don't think that's broadly applicable to every tank and every support. There's a lot of tanks that are relatively interesting. Hulk, Captain America, and at times Thor do have a lot of complexity with how they're being played, and a lot of interesting nuance, which I fell in love with, they still lack significantly the same amount of skill expression and creativity in how they play compared to a lot of the other DPS. And ultimately, I find that to be true even more so with support. See, a lot of people like to say to me, oh, well, you haven't played enough support, you'll learn to love it, and there's a lot of nuance, and Loki could do all these cool things, and this and that. But with the exception of Jeff, who I think can hard flank a little bit, the amount of different positions and different playstyles that are actually viable and optimal are just isn't there. It reminds me a lot of early Lifeweaver play before we got a lot of reworks in Overwatch where people were saying, oh, you're just not creative enough. And it turns out that even the best players in the world couldn't make the character work. There was just hard limitations with what was actually good with the character. And I'm sorry, Gold, Plat, and I guess Grandmaster players in Marvel Rivals can't tell me otherwise. Now, Lifeweaver has received a lot of changes since then, have added depth, nuance, and strength to his kit that allow different creative playstyles. There's a lot of creative and interesting Grandmaster Lifeweaver players now, but that's because of the character, how he's designed to evolve over the last couple of years, not how he was initially released. And ultimately with Marvel Rivals, I've seen no improvement into the support playstyle. I remember being very excited looking at how Invisible Woman's kit worked, the push, the pull, the suck, the slow, the invisibility even, but ultimately the way that she's actually played in the highest level and the low level and the mid levels doesn't allow for really much creativity at all. And before anybody says otherwise, I challenge you to pull open a professional player or a high-level player of Invisible Woman and tell me where is the creativity of how you're positioning? Where's the off-angling? Where's the flanking? Where's the aggression? Again, it's just healer. It's not support. And ultimately, a lot of the kit utility is used in a very passive manner. I find the same thing with Luna Snow, with Mantis, and with, yes, Loki too. Everyone's like, oh, well, Loki, you can angle and run. But ultimately, that's not how the character is often being played. Even the damage output of the character is situational, and more often than not, you're focused on stacking clones and healing. I get a lot of gaslighting from the community about this because people apparently just don't pull up high-level support play and look how it's actually being played. Farm a support ult, counter with the support ult. It's not that it's easy or low skill, it's just not very engaging for me. And I contrast that along with some of my other tank criticisms that seem to be more brawl frontline focused, whether you're talking Groot, Doctor Strange, or Magneto. But I think you take all those tank and support things and you compare them to some of the DPS designs like Psylocke, Magic, Black Panther, Spider-Man, who is, yes, controversial, and I just don't think the comparison is very fair. I think there's been a lot more interesting nuance in how DPS characters are being implemented in Marvel Rivals. And honestly, I'm not just saying that DPS superiority here. I'm saying the support and tank players deserve more love, but ultimately, is that even possible with how the game is functioned? Is the game design just hard capped by how much damage and how much healing that you could do? And the creativity that you could express with how you position and how you play is really not all that important. You see, there's a reason why people will say that Captain America would be a tank that functions so much more in Overwatch, because I look at that character and I'm like, oh my gosh, he's super fun, super cool, but ultimately you're just a tickle monster because of the amount of sustain. Does your utility even matter? I look at Mr. Fantastic. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed playing Mr. Fantastic, but ultimately it just didn't feel like my support tank DPS hybrid playstyle really did anything because of the amount of damage and sustain that was available to the game. So ultimately it just feels like some wasted designs. Heck, even Invisible Woman, who is a support character, has a phenomenal kit that just isn't really utilized because of the gameplay loop of the game. And again, the big thing isn't just how the game is released, it's how it's been developed over the last few months, and I haven't seen any of these things change. Ultimately, it really comes down to some duelists can take angles, tanks basically trade in the front line, support sit in the back and heal, and that's ultimately the gameplay loop that hasn't really changed much over the last 4 or 5 months, even going all the way back to the alpha, so almost a year now. I also think there's been some missed opportunities for team-ups. While I love the concept kind of encouraging team play, I don't think that they always check the box of a successful team-up for me. 2 things. Number 1, you want the team-up to be a conscious choice from the player. I think Wolverine and Hulk is a great example, Punisher, Rocket, Johnny and Storm, where you can choose to actually do the thing from both perspectives. So I'm going to choose to do this, to choose to do that. So there's active choice being implemented on both sides of the equation, which makes the engagement so much more interesting. I also think there's been some missed opportunities for team-ups. While I love the concept for encouraging team play, I do think that team-ups need to do 2 things. Number 1, be consciously chosen. In other words, you need to actually choose to utilize the team-up. And number 2, there needs to be some sort of choice from both sides of the equation, not just one person benefiting. A good example would be Wolverine and Hulk, where Wolverine is grabbed and then Wolverine is thrown. Not only is it funny and fun, but ultimately it is something that requires a decision from both players, and if you don't use it, you're missing out. Punisher and Rocket, I think, and the Winter Soldier, the infinite ammo one, that one's maybe not the most interesting in execution, but the fact that the Rocket has to choose to place it and then the Punisher has to respond is definitely interesting. Even Johnny's Storm, where you're able to combo your ultimates, again, a choice, something that both characters have to kind of apply to. And I feel a lot of the team-ups are not only raw stat values, but even when they're not raw stat values, for example, you have Magneto and Scarlet Witches, ultimately Scarlet Witch doesn't really get any conscious choice of that. It's just a free button for Magneto to push, whereas Scarlet Witch basically doesn't get any extra button to push. there isn't as much engagement on both sides of the equation, is what I'm trying to say. Finally, a couple of minor nitpicks, less to do with the game design as a whole, but things that really hinder my enjoyment of the game. Map design. I know there's been a lot of mixed feedback on the value of destructible environments and interactable environments. In other words, environments that just start raining damage on you. And while I'm personally not as big of a fan of them, I think that there is a time and a place where they can be implemented fun. I don't think that they necessarily contribute that much to the enjoyment of the game, but they are fun for clips, I suppose. My biggest problem with the map design is more of, frankly, an objective look at how maps need to be designed. You see, there's a reason that the 3-lane theory for map design has kind of been a thing for a long time, where you have a main choke, a left flank, and a right flank. It allows for choice, skill expression, and while there are some exceptions to which angle is optimal, and there are some creativity in how maps can be designed, I do think that somewhat sticking to that rule whenever you can is really important. Ultimately, if there isn't as many choices, then we have a 2CP and Overwatch problem where everybody is miserable unless you're defending. Ultimately, Marvel Rivals suffers from a lot of dead ends, a lot of nasty chokes, and a lot of paths that just kind of lead to nowhere. Map variety is a really underrated part of keeping a map experience or keeping a game experience fresh, and ultimately I think the map designers have a lot of things to learn about what keeps a map engaging and interesting from both sides of the equation. And finally here, before I get to my competitive integrity discussion, I think that the performance of this game is just horrendous. This goes without saying. It doesn't matter what type of computer that you run. Even a supercomputer is going to have FPS issues. There's a lot of tech issues that are within the game. Visuals are bugged out. I even have issues with OBS running this game where I have to launch it as administrator, otherwise it doesn't recognize it to stream it. And this kind of goes without saying. If you're aiming to have your game to be accessible for a larger audience, which I think Rivals is, performance issues are incredibly important for you to be able to reach the demographic and the audience that you're aiming for. Finally, and this one will be a little bit shorter because I think this has already been well documented in a couple of my other videos. I have one up talking about the matchmaking conspiracy. I highly recommend checking that one out. But the competitive integrity is easily the second most discouraging thing about this game, where there just isn't really competitive integrity. Rank inflation is huge and a huge problem where you win more than you lose for SR, so you can climb all the way up to the higher ranks in the game, even with negative win rates. And what this means is not only are you questioning whether you actually earned the rank that you actually got or did you just grind for it, but also it really compromises the quality of the matchmaking. Now, matchmaking in first-person shooters and just games in general is really tricky. Team-based games really struggle with this because player inconsistency is a huge problem, even in a quote-unquote perfectly balanced ranked lobby. But Marvel Rivals really exacerbates this because you might have a Grandmaster player that if they were in any other honest skill curve game, they would be platinum at best. There are legitimately games where you will feel like you're playing in a platinum lobby with your teammates playing versus Celestials that are on the way up, and that unironically may be true. Playtime accounts for everything when it comes to rank in this game, not competence. There's a serious lack of meritocracy in the way that this matchmaking works, and this leads to huge inconsistencies in game quality. Ultimately, this is done for engagement optimized matchmaking, and when people say that, I don't even necessarily mean some sort of witch hunt about that they prioritize wins early on your gameplay time, and then that you're more likely to lose the longer you play. Just simple rank inflation is engagement optimized matchmaking, where it tells you something that this is supposed to be a fair match or that you earned the rank that you are, but it's not true. It's just rewarding you for playing more and more and more. The longer time you spend in the game, the more you're likely to spend money on the game and buy skins. And that to me is not only something that turns me off from the game, but kind of disturbs me about the gaming culture as a whole. We're very slowly becoming victims of the algorithm with things that are telling lies about us and encouraging us and trying to control what we do and how we feel and how we play. And yes, that's a little bit tinfoil hat, but I think even small things like this are really, really unhealthy just because it doesn't tell the truth about what you actually are and where you actually belong, and does so at the expense of other people. You see, the problem is that rank inflation isn't harmless. It hurts people. It hurts the enjoyment of the game. It hurts the quality of the game. It hurts the integrity of somebody working for and reaching a higher rank. When I reached Grandmaster Season 0 with like a 58, 59, 60% win rate, when I was bragging to my friends, they all were like, oh yeah, but how many games did it take? I've got a friend who's 44% win rate and reached Grandmaster. And when I first heard that really took the wind out of my sails. So the excitement of reaching Grandmaster was stolen from me. So everybody has this nice even experience of where, yeah, it doesn't feel that bad, and I guess but ultimately, like, what are we missing out on? The whole accomplishment of reaching a rank should mean something, and in Marvel Rivals, frankly, it just doesn't really mean much at all. Especially as a competitive player and a coach, this was just the elephant in the room that I could not ignore. The game design was something that I have hopes for and evolving as the game goes on. Maybe we'll see, maybe we won't. But ultimately, if NetEase doesn't back off of its kind of dystopian approach to matchmaking, I will not be coming back to this game seriously. Final point here, and this is more of an etc. side note, and this really ties in with that TF2 discussion we had earlier on. It really couldn't live up to its own expectations for me. The way that people hyped up this game, going into this game, I ultimately knew that for some people that were more competitively focused like myself, ultimately I would enjoy it, but I would probably be coming back to Overwatch because a lot of the hype within the Overwatch community was more of a response to anger versus Overwatch itself and how at least it wasn't Overwatch. It honestly felt like almost a political fervor, which was a little bit disheartening to me. Ultimately, I felt like a lot of the Overwatch community expectations of Rivals was built on emotion and hyperbole. And ultimately, while the anger at Overwatch was deserved, I just don't think that for the competitive community within the shooters, it wasn't going to be able to live up to its own hype. And I think you see that even right now where so much of the game it's just fallen off once people have kind of forgotten some of their anger versus Overwatch as the developers have had to earn back the trust. Oh, well, that's a conversation for a longer video. You can check out my review of Play Nice here, where I discuss a lot more of the lies that Overwatch and Activision told. Ultimately, it was saddening to me that we couldn't just compare Marvel Rivals off of its own merit, but ultimately a lot of the Overwatch comparisons weren't made in good faith and just were made from emotion, which ultimately not only compromised the quality of the comparison, but the quality of our feedback for Rivals itself. To wrap things up here, I know I'm going to make some people mad here. Ultimately, I'm trying to look at this as fair as I possibly can, and this is not a recommendation that you should not enjoy or should not play the game. This is more of an explanation of why people like me, players like me, are not likely going to stick with this game moving forward. Because I'm not just speaking with me, but a lot of people within the competitive Overwatch community. Why do they move on? This is why. Maybe this is not something that Rivals should even change. Maybe the dopamine, maybe the design of supports, maybe the design of tanks, and maybe even the matchmaking is something that is baked into the game itself and is part of the reason why it's successful. I honestly don't know. I suspect that at least partly it's true. But if it's ultimately going to want to keep players like me, those things have to change. Whether they should or not, well, that's not really my call. And if you're the type of person that enjoys what Rival is currently, then you shouldn't feel guilty or stupid for enjoying it. Ultimately, a game is a game, and if a game is making people have fun, that's by far the most important thing. Yes, more important than in competitive integrity, and more important than quote-unquote good game design. Ultimately, I think it was important for me to kind of clarify my thoughts and why this game has not stuck with me, but ultimately I'm just a competitive game snob with opinions that probably don't apply to the vast majority of the player base. Regardless of your opinions on Rivals, I do want to thank them for the amount of good things that they have done. They've inspired within me, and I hope that they've inspired within the Overwatch development community about new things to try and new questions to be answered. Ultimately, regardless of how Rivals ages, changes, or even if it changes at all, it has been a remarkable success within the hero shooter and just the gaming genre as a whole, and I'm thankful for its existence. Not just because of the questions that it raised and the feedback that it gave to us, but ultimately just because it was a really fun game.